Eddin Ibrahim is well known by all Israelis who spent any period of time in Egypt, and actually by anyone who follows developments in the Egyptian polity and academia. In addition to his long service as professor of sociology at the American University of Cairo, he taught in a number of American universities, was a public policy scholar at the Woodrow Wilson School, and a fellow at the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at Harvard. He is the founder and chairman of the Ibn Khaldun Center for Development Studies in Cairo, an institute which since its establishment has played a leading role in disseminating the concept of civil society, al-Muqtama' al-Madani, in Egypt. Saad, as he is known to his friends, is a leading human rights and democracy activist in Egypt. He champions the cause of minorities and women, stands for separation of state and religion, and for peace. He paid heavily for his courageous criticism of Mubarak's autocracy, but remained a relentless defender of his beliefs. We are honored and delighted to host this independent-minded intellectual at our university. Dr. Ibrahim, Dr. Saad Ibrahim, we are delighted to have you here and eager to hear your views and your perspective on the issues which are at the center of our meeting.
1 hour every morning before going to prison. I came out of prison completely paralyzed. It took 5 surgeries in Johns Hopkins Medical Hospital to make me able to speak again like I'm speaking to you now, and to be able to at least stand and walk a little bit. But I'm still pretty much embedded in much of activities I would have liked to do. I'd like to express my gratitude for being invited by Professor Shimon Shamir and the Middle East Center, and to share this platform with my good friend and mentor, Shlomo Avni, who keeps claiming that he does not know much about Egypt, and yet when he talks about Egypt, it's music to my ears. I find that he knows more about Egypt than he claims. And he knows actually aspects that I do not know. So I want to just express my gratitude for having the honor to share that forum with him and to have listened to him. And I hope he will continue with this disclaimer, because obviously with every disclaimer, he seemed to be going deeper and deeper in the subject. Now, he alluded, and I think eloquently, to what many Western scholars for a while, for nearly 20 years, talked about as being once Islamic exceptionalism. And then when that went out of fashion, they talked about Arab exceptionalism. And when that went out of fashion and Tunisia came into the fore, and people were wondering about Egypt, they talked about Egyptian exceptionalism. Now, all exceptionalism, in the way that our colleagues, Western scholars, addressed, seem to just indicate one thing, that people everywhere in the world are the same. When they have the opportunity to express themselves, with the opportunity to outcry against despotism, against tyranny, against injustice, they will do it. The fact that some of them a little bit late in doing it doesn't mean they are an exception to the rule. Sooner or later, they will rise. And that's what we saw in Tunisia. And Tunisia was, to my mind, I call it Cinderella of the Arab Spring. Because as a small country, was not much in the way of influence in regional politics, and yet their ability to peacefully bring down the rule of a despotic leader who had remained in power for over 20 years, Ben Ali, was an inspiration, not only to all Arabs and Muslims, but especially to Egyptians. And the Egyptians used to call each other, to talk to each other. If Tunisians can do that, then we, a small country, can do that to a despotic, tyrannical leader. Why can't we? That was a question that was raised over and over in that interim period between the Tunisian Revolution and the Egyptian Revolution. It was about a year and a half, but ultimately, Egyptians rose up in Tahrir Square. Many of you followed probably the development there, and I don't have to recount them. But I just want to emphasize one point that Professor Avineri alluded to, and that is the role of civil society. It is not the Egyptian bureaucrats, it was not the Egyptian army that went to Tahrir Square. It was young men and women like you, in the audience here, who felt that enough is enough. And as a matter of fact, their movement predating Tahrir was a movement called Kifaya, enough. Kifaya in Arabic means enough. And that was the slogan under which they were able to mobilize some 13 to 15 million Egyptians to sign petition, peaceful demands for change under Mubarak. Mubarak dismissed them. When he was told about Tunisia, he said, Egypt is not Tunisia. Of course, Egypt is not Tunisia. No country is a replica of another country. But there are lessons to learn. And what I have learned in the process of preparing for this meeting is that 3 or 4 historical moments had nearly repeated themselves in a very broad way. Professor Abdiri referred to Arabi, the Arabi uprising. That Arabi uprising against foreign Western influence and against the Khedivial tyrannical rule at the time was nearly repeated, of course, with modification, twice after that. Once in 1919, which is really a focal point in this conference, when 3 of the popular leaders wanted to go to the Paris Peace Conference after the First World War, again inspired by the American President Wilson, who talked about self-determination. And these were people like Saad Zaghloul, Ali Fahmy, and others. They wanted to go to the Paris Peace Conference to plead their case for Egyptian independence. They were denied exit because the British had occupied Egypt in 1882, and they were the power to allow people to move around, to travel or not to travel. So when these leaders, Saad Zaghloul and 3 of his colleagues, were denied the right to travel to Paris to attend the peace conference, that is when the 1919 uprising broke out. And interestingly enough, It broke out because the first angry demonstration that walked in the streets of Cairo, the first person to be killed in that demonstration was a woman by the name of Shafiqa Muhammad. And I want to tell you that the inspiration of Shafiqa Muhammad, I have a sister that's called Shafiqa. I have an aunt that's called Shafiqa. In my extended family, there are at least 6 or 7 Shafiqas named after that woman who triggered the events of the 1919 revolution. Now, there was something also very important about that revolution. When the leaders were denied traveling to Paris, the British High Commissioner challenged them. Said, whom do you represent? You represent yourself. You don't represent the Egyptian people. So there was, as a result of that, a mass movement led by youngsters to get Egyptians to sign petitions authorizing Saad and 3 of his colleagues to represent Egyptians in the Paris Peace Conference. And to me, that was a very early example of the power of civil society that Sean talked about. Who organized these petitions? Egypt at the time had a population of over 20 million. The petition out of those 20 million was over 6 million. 6 million people signed or stamped with their fingers, because not everybody knew how to write at the time. And that episode would be revived in the collective memory of young Egyptians who led the 2 movements of Kifaya and who went to Tahrir Square and demanded reform, demanded new elections, because they felt that the election that had taken place a few weeks earlier were completely rigged. And had the regime listened to these demands, maybe the course of history would have changed. They tried to dismiss the people in Tahrir 3 ways. The first was the traditional way of water hoses. And that did not work. The people continued to demonstrate. So the second attempt was low-flying planes breaking the sound barrier, creating real terror in the square. And yet, young Egyptians who gathered there did not disperse. The third attempt was getting trucks to drive at full speed in Tahrir Square, killing or wounding tens of youngsters. And yet, that did not frighten the young people who gathered in Tahrir. And we're talking now about 5th, 6th, 7th day of being in Tahrir. And in fact, Tahrir turned into kind of what would be the right word, almost like a Greek democracy forum, because every group in Tahrir coming from somewhere, either from a different profession, different organization, different province. They were having discussions, teachings, learning, talking, playing music, acting. It was almost like a festival. So despite the early violence that the government used to disperse the demonstrators, they persisted, and that was a very important lesson in the event that would come later with the Muslim Brothers. But I don't want to disagree with Shlomo on one thing, and that is that the Muslim Brothers came to Tahrir Square 5 days after the gathering started. 5 days. I happened to be in the States at the time, but my wife was in the square, and I told Shlomo about that. I told Shimon about that right from the first minute. And she was reporting to me. I was in the States, thanks to mobile telephones. She was reporting to me what was happening in Tahrir Square hour by hour. And I am diverging a little bit to that little scene because some of my friends in Washington knew I was in Cambridge at the time, called me and asked me to come down for consultation. So as I was taking the train to go down to Washington, my wife was reporting to me developments as they happened in Tahrir. When I got to the Washington, I was ushered into the National Security Council meeting room. Everybody, the Egyptian establishment was there. And I was asked to give them a reading of what's happening in Tahrir and what's happening in Cairo. So I said, my wife is right there, and let her tell you what's happening. So I called her, we put her on the loudspeaker in the meeting room, and she began to tell them what was happening in Cairo. And there walks in President Obama. He's briefed, transpired the hour before, and he heard this voice from Cairo. Somebody told him this is a lady from Cairo, from Tahrir Square. So he asked her 3 questions. 1, who are the people in Tahrir? Who are these people? Said, well, these are the people like the ones who elected you, Mr. President. Except that they did not gather $10 each to get your campaign started, but they're here. These are middle class college students, mostly. He said, what about the Muslim Brothers? Are they there? He said, no, not so far. And that was true. The Muslim Brothers did not show up until the 5th day. So he asked her, is there any anti-American slogans in the square? He said, so far, no, Mr. President. But unless you come publicly and support there were modest demands at the time of the youngsters here in Egypt, I will be the one who will raise slogans against America. He said, what about Israel? Is it anti-Israeli? He said, no. People are very focused on Egypt here in the square. Anyhow, after a few exchanges like that, he said, I want you to continue to report to us every few hours. And he had learned in the process that I'm her husband. So he threatened, he said, we'll keep your husband here as a hostage to continue receiving reports. I said, all right, that's a deal. And she continued to report to the National Security. And then, finally, she demanded, I stayed in Washington, actually, not as a hostage, but voluntarily, to advise my friends and the White House and to brief them on what was going on. And then, at one time, since she had been part of that scene from the first day, from the first hour, they asked her to speak to the Tahrir. My wife, for those of you who don't know, she's American. And while she's learned Arabic, but still her Arabic does not allow her to address 500,000 or 1 million people in Tahrir Square. Yet the enthusiasm for her to get up on the stand and to talk was so overwhelming. And I was on the phone. I said, go ahead. Say whatever you want to say. She addressed the public. And since then, it's been very hard to manage affairs of my family. Said, did you speak to Tahrir? I said, no. I said, well, shut up then. So in every discussion, she reminds me that she is one of the few people who spoke publicly in Tahrir Square. Now, what did she say in Tahrir? She said basically that she is so proud that this is happening in a country that she had adopted, that she had taken on the nationality of Egypt, and that she is raising her family in Egypt, and she and her husband, who is listening to her in Washington right now, were dreaming of a moment like this, to at least challenge all the kind of exceptionalism that is said about Muslims, about Arabs, about Egyptians. And then the crowd was so enthusiastic listening to this broken Arabic of this American lady. And when she said, you know, my husband is listening to me now, and he will be very proud that you youngsters and you fellow Egyptians have risen up to the challenge. So they started shouting in unison, ask him to come back, ask him to come back. So in a very theatrical manner, she said, Saad Ibrahim, Tahrir Square is commanding you to come back. So tomorrow at this time, you should be here in Tahrir Square. And she closed the telephone. I told Shimon about this. He had not known about it. I said, you know, after an hour, I called her back. I said, how could you do that? She said, yes, this is history in the making. And you have been all your life talking about revolution and social movements and teaching and lecturing. And when the moment comes, you are out of the country, come immediately. I said, how could I come? I haven't told my students that I'll be absent. I haven't made a reservation. How could you promise the crowd in Tahrir that I'll be there in 24 hours? I said, go to Kennedy Airport immediately, right now. You'll find that Egypt Air flight is empty or nearly empty. Nobody's coming to Egypt these days. Use your credit card, buy a ticket, and I want you here in 12 hours. And my wife is very commanding, and I listened to her. So I said, well, I'll see what I can do. But that's exactly what I did. After I hanged up with her, I called my assistant where I was teaching, to gather my students, tell them that I'll be absent for a few days. And I drove to Kennedy Airport, went to Egypt Air Desk. It was empty, true. I used my credit card as she had recommended, bought a ticket, got on the plane, and 3 hours in the air, the captain of the flight got the microphone, and I said, I would like to speak to fellow Egyptian travelers on this flight. I just received the news from Cairo that President Mubarak agreed to step down. You cannot imagine how the plane, everybody clapped, everybody cheered, and the rest of the trip, this was about 3 hours into the flight, the other 7 hours, everybody gathered in the middle of the plane, and it became like a seminar in discussing what was happening, what is going to happen, fears, aspirations, and anxieties. And it was the quickest transatlantic flight I ever took. Time went so fast, and everybody was in a very joyful, celebratory mood. When I arrived at the Cairo airport, there was a crowd waiting for me outside. And the security is always worried about crowds. Doesn't matter what kind of crowd, but any crowding is a nightmare for security. So they ushered me out of without even stamping my passport as returning. And I was taken directly to Tahrir Square. And my wife's credibility of being, an iron woman who brought her husband back in 12 hours was verified. Now, all of this episode and storytelling is to make 2 or 3 points. One is there is greater collective memory that seemed to seep in from one generation to another. And I was so surprised by people in Tahrir Square when I went to Tahrir Square with her, and I couldn't address the crowd the way she did. Nobody listened to me. They were more interested in her than in me, which is fine. But I was very happy to see these crowds and to see the peaceful nature of the crowd. The following few days, we used to go from early morning until midnight. And as I said, it was like festivals we used to have in the 60s in America as students. And my problem, and I have a weekly column published in one of our main newspapers called Al-Masri Al-Yawm, because I asked in Tahrir Square, where are the leaders of this revolution? There's no leaders. We are all leaders. Nice that everybody is a leader. But the hijacking of the revolution, both the Russian Revolution back in 1914 and the Iranian Revolution in 1979, triggered to my mind, and I was afraid, and I said, this revolution will be hijacked because nobody wants to claim leadership. Nobody wants to take charge. The only 2 groups that were organized, Shalom, and I think he referred to that, were the army and the Muslim Brothers. And surprisingly, the way that the Muslim Brothers are organized is like an army, a civilian army. Very hierarchical, based on a sama wa ta'a, listen and demand and obey, just like the military. So, and these are the two organized entities at the time. Yes, we had professional groups, syndicates, niqabat, and so on. But these two entities, the Muslim Brothers and the army, were the candidates to hijack the revolution. From these idealistic young men and women who had no interest in power whatsoever, the word power is their word for them. So when you ask about leadership, who's in charge, it's almost like accusing them of being like everybody else, not this utopian idealist youngsters. Anyhow, my fear materialized because the Muslim Brothers were quick to get a constitution to their liking and to have an election before everybody was ready. They were the only organized entity, and therefore they managed to win the election and to take over. Now, here is what the youngest brother of Hassan al-Banna, the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, had long told me, and I recalled that in one of my articles. I asked Mr. Gamal al-Banna, the younger brother of Hassan al-Banna, who is a member of the board of trustees of Ibn Khaldun, why hadn't he joined the Muslim Brothers? His brother that he highly respected and loved is the founder. So I said, how come? A movement that nearly had a 1 million follower in the mid-40s, late 40s, how come you did not join them? His answer was the following. He said, as a young man, my father died before I finished my college, got to college. So he worked with a high school diploma as a worker in one of the textile factories at the time. But being educated a little bit, being from a literary family, he managed to rise very quickly in the textile industry that he was a worker in. And he was elected to the union of that industry and so on. So he was telling me that he saw the difference between how the unions operate and how the Muslim Brothers operate. He said, I was a youngster when my brother was still alive, and they used to have a very Masonic way. They will turn the lights off, light the candle, and have a dagger or a gun, and they will all swear to listen and obey. Very hierarchical, no discussion, but to listen to obey to their commanders, to the more senior in among them. He said, having seen both how the trade unions work and how the Muslim Brothers work, it was clear to me that in my disposition as Gamal al-Banna, even though I was the younger brother, that I would rather be a unionist than to be a Muslim brother. That was Gamal al-Banna. And therefore, when I wrote my articles after having Tahrir and expressed my fears that the Muslim Brothers will take over or the army will take over, and either one of them is authoritarian in nature, authoritarian, totalitarian in nature. Many people didn't like what I wrote. I was debated, just like these youngsters cursed me. I was cursed by many people for having anticipated that. And yet, the events of the following 3-4 years proved that my fears were justified. Now, where to go from here? I'd like to conclude by saying that, and I told that to Shimon, and my wife is always eager to warn me against repeating myself to my audiences. I said to Shimon this morning that I am optimistic because not only Egypt, but the whole region is going through some very interesting transition. Not only the Arab Spring, but the very fact that in one of the key countries, Saudi Arabia, there is a young crown prince who is very visionary. He's 32 years old, visionary, and have been dreaming of modernizing Saudi Arabia. He's the one who was behind the decree to allow women to drive, and that, to me, is a revolution itself for Saudi women to be able to drive. But he's also behind the decision to allow 3 or 4 islands off the coast of Saudi Arabia in the Red Sea to be free zones where you can have bars, you can have gambling, you can have whatever you want to have. Instead of traveling to Dubai or to Bahrain or to Europe to do it, they said, we'll do it right here off the coast of Saudi Arabia on these islands. But the most revolutionary of his ideas, to my mind, is the dream of having a common market between Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Egypt, and Israel. I don't know if you've been following that scheme that he had proposed or not. It's called DUME, and I don't know where the word came from. DUME. DUME is inspired by the European common market experience, and he wanted to make these 4 countries the seeds of this common zone, and he would like to restart. Young generation heard about Oriental Express. He talked about the Oriental Express to go all the way, not only from Egypt to Istanbul or to Prague, but he wanted all the way from Casablanca on the Atlantic, all the way to Madrid, to circle the Mediterranean, basically. Now, it is a vision, very inspiring, interesting, whether it will be implemented or not. But as Margaret Mead once said, the great anthropologist, every idea, every great scheme in history started as an idea in the minds of some very intelligent but determined individuals. And if Mohammed bin Salman is one of those, I think the region is ready for him. Saudi Arabia definitely is ready for him, and the rest of the region is ready for him. And I hope you guys here in Israel are ready for him. With that, I conclude, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Saad Eddin Ibrahim. for giving us a picture of these developments that only you can give. I can't imagine anybody else having the same perspective, the same insight. And we are looking forward to hear more about it during our discussions tomorrow. Now, before doing what chairpersons usually do, so thanking all those who are behind this meeting, I want to say a word about the interference we had before our guest started his presentation. Apparently, they are against tatbi'. And there is a very clear answer to their complaint. And I'm tatbi'. Explain. Tatbi' is normalization. I want to say it especially to you, Saad. The answer to them is the fact that in this university, there are hundreds of Palestinian students, men and women. And it's very obvious that they don't share their perspective, their views about relations between Arabs and Israeli Jews. I think this puts them in place as extremists who should have behaved better. So let me, at the conclusion, thank, first of all, our speakers and all those who contributed to the organization of this gathering. First and foremost, Ms. Joyce van de Bilt. She navigated the preparations for this event with efficiency and thoughtfulness. Our thanks also to the Dayan Center, the Dayan Center team headed by Ms. Efrat Shulman Arad, who took care of all the arrangements that made this meeting possible. Thanks are also due to the organizing committee of the international workshop, which includes, in addition to the three who spoke in this evening's meeting, also Professor Eli Podeh and Dr. Ephraim Barak. And finally, many thanks to the audience for attending this opening of our workshop on Egypt. Erev Tov.